Central Europe and the Middle East and Africa, 16% growth throughout Latin America. U.S. grew 9%, and it's a pretty mature and developing market. We were up over 10% in Europe, excluding the U.K., and Asia was up almost 10%. So really, as you look around the world, it's really the U.K. that is not performing as well as the rest of the economies around the world. But I look at the data, and I really don't see any evidence of slowdown.
Do the last few weeks, particularly how trade talks have gone and the threat of tariffs, change anything for you? Do you worry about business sentiment or consumer sentiment?
You always worry about consumer sentiment. You know, back in December when the markets weren't very good, the government had shut down, you had the trade talk uncertainty, the Brexit uncertainty. Clearly, we saw some fall off. We haven't really seen that fall off. So I remain, cautiously optimistic.
Larry Summers says there's a 50% chance of recession. Do you agree?
I'm not an economist. That's what Larry spends his time doing. I think that we certainly have gone through a very long positive cycle, and at some point, cycles are cycles, and we'll see a reversal. But I'm not in the predicting business. I don't know whether we'll see a slowdown or something that qualifies the technical definition of recession. But again, right now, based on the data I see, things are still holding up quite well.
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the trade talks because it's front and center for us. China, of course, still close to American credit cards and payment processors. At one point earlier this year, it looked like Visa and MasterCard might be part of some deal. I haven't heard much on that now. Where does it stand? And watching the most recent headlines, does it make it harder for Visa to move into China?
Well, first of all, we've been in China for almost 4 decades. We have offices in Beijing and Shanghai, and we have relationships with 55 different banks in China, and it's a very important market for us on an outbound travel perspective.
I'm talking more about
domestic.
Getting credit cards
We do not have a
and
domestic
processors.
license. We are continuing to pursue one. I think that you can imagine that the current trade talks impact those types of decisions. So I think it would be safe to say that we remain patient, but I think the trade talks are going to have to work their way out before we see something happen.
Do you think that Visa, MasterCard could be part of a trade deal if we ever get one?
Well, I think that both sides, the Chinese government, the U.S. government, recognize that this is an issue that's been hanging out there for a number of years. So it certainly is our hope that if a good comprehensive trade bill gets passed, that in some way, shape, or form, it's a positive for us.
Now, how does the current market volatility impact your deal flow? You guys have been incredibly active this year on the M&A front. What do you see looking towards the rest of the year?
Well, we've got a aspiration to be in the middle of any funds that move around the world. We want to be in the middle of it. And we'll partner, build, or buy to get there. We have not made a more concerted effort to be in the buying mode, but we did have a busy quarter. In this particular case, when we see opportunities to increase our reach, which we did with Earthport, or increase our capabilities, which we did with the acquisitions of Verify and Payworks, we in fact go after it. So I think that we feel good about the fact that we've increased our reach and we've increased our capabilities. And when we see those opportunities, Deirdre will continue to pursue them.
Okay, my colleague John Fort has a question for you back in New York. John.
Hey, Al, good to see you. I want to ask, Apple started rolling out Apple Card yesterday. It's linked to its Apple Pay service. They're touting lower fees and fast cash back. How big a deal is that? Is it a big deal? Has Apple Pay been a big deal for the digital payment space?
Well, John, first of all, good to see you. Thank you. Look, the reality is Apple's a great partner at Visa. We've been working with them for quite some time on Apple Cash and Apple Pay. They've got a great brand. They've got a retail footprint, and it's certainly no surprise that a company like theirs with a great brand will want to eventually do a co-brand. They've done that. The little I've seen of it, it's quite cool. They've got a good following, loyal following of customers. So ultimately, those customers will vote by getting the card and using the card over time. So I think it's a little too early to tell, John, just how successful it will be. But Apple's a good brand and a good marketer.
If it is successful, there's 1.4 billion active Apple devices, and MasterCard is going to be the rails for this credit card. Did Visa miss an opportunity here? What do you think?
Well, co-brands come up all the time, and
but this one in particular is different. This is Apple, and like I said, 1.4 billion devices.
Yeah, but again, the reality is that most people around the world have credit cards. So a new proposition has to be powerful to unearth the inertia that sits in people's minds and wallets. It's not easy to take somebody's front of wallet, front of purse card and displace it. So I think we're going to have to see over time. We look at every single co-brand deal. Some we win and some we lose, but we have a pretty darn good track record.
Now, this is part of big tech's move more and more into fintech and financial services. You've got Apple. We just spoke about Amazon, Facebook, and Libra, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. They've traditionally been partners to Visa. Are they becoming more and more threats to you guys as they go further into financial services?
Well, the great thing, a couple of interesting things about the payment ecosystem. One is it grows every day. It's very unusual. It's hard to find a lot of industries where you can come up with examples of people coming in every day to figure out how to grow the pie, which is what we do. And it's also a multiplayer ecosystem. And the reality is that there are friends and frenemies, and we compete with companies that we also partner with. And I think that's going to continue to be the case going forward. Again, we'll talk to anybody, anytime, and we want to be in the middle of every possible transaction that happens.
You don't see them as a threat so far?
No, I think that they're going to do what they do. But if we continue to be a good partner and help them as much as we can, I think that there's plenty of room for all of us to cooperate together.
Sarah's got a question for you back in New York.
No, yeah, Al, just wanted to follow up on the Libra question. Since you are a charter member of the Libra Association with some of your competitors and Facebook, because you, legitimate companies with a lot of scale and Facebook with a lot of users are in it, I think it's made central banks around the world really question how big this can get and whether ultimately it can be a threat to monetary policy and financial stability. How do you answer them, and when are you going to have answers for them? Because I understand it's a little early in the process to have everything figured out.
So it's super early in the process. We're not a member of anything, nor is anybody else a member of anything. 27 companies have signed a non-binding letter of intent. It's an intriguing concept. That's what's intrigued us. So we've signed a non-binding letter of intent. There's tremendous amounts of work that has to be done on governance and making sure that we are able to meet or exceed the expectations and the rules and the laws of regulators around the world. And we will not ultimately join the association if, in fact, we're not satisfied that that's the case. And there's just a lot of work to continue to be done. But I think it's an intriguing concept. And if it actually happened, it wouldn't be a Facebook initiative. It would be a separate association of which Facebook would be one of the players at the table. But our standards, as it relates to regulation, are super high. And we will not do anything that we think doesn't meet our own personal standards as well as the standards of regulators that we respect around the world.
Al, I want to ask you about real-time payments. The Fed has jumped into this space with FedNow, though it's going to take a while for that to get implemented. And the talk is that it should allow for payments to instantly show up, for example, in workers' bank accounts. It could save the poor $60 billion by some estimates. You've made some comments in the past that suggested that perhaps real-time payments aren't that big a deal. I wonder if you could put some nuance on that and how quickly you hope that real-time payments become a reality in the U.S.
Sure, John. So real-time payments are happening around the world as governments around the world and countries around the world look to modernize aged ACH systems. People are putting new RTP systems or real-time payment systems in place. There's about 35 to 40 countries that already have them in place. There's another 30 or 40 countries that are building them right now. So the Fed's announcement yesterday or the day before was not a surprise. And usually these real-time payment systems are backed and initiated either by the government or by a set of banks. So what it looks like is going to ultimately happen in the United States is that we'll actually have two real-time payment systems, one that will be backed by the banks and one that will be backed by the Fed. As it relates to how successful they are, I think the reality is it will depend on each market will be different. And these networks are open to everybody. So they're open to Visa, for example. So to the degree that we need to use a network in another country, like we are with Earthport, our recent acquisition, where we can now reach the bank accounts of virtually everybody in the world in the top 50 markets and move money, we'll continue to take advantage of that.
Al, Morgan here. I want to shift gears a little bit. A lot of focus on interest rates, given the dramatic moves we've seen not only in Treasury rates here in the U.S., but around the world as more central banks continue to ease and ease more dramatically. What does it mean for Visa, especially if we see lower for longer? How have you gamed that out?
You know, it doesn't really impact us very much at all. You know, we personally, as a company, have very little debt, and as you know, we're not the actual credit card issuer, so we don't hold any of that credit debt. So I think that more important to us is the sentiment of consumers, the geopolitical environment around the world, and if people feel confident, they have jobs, they're seeing growth in real wages that they bring home. Those are the factors that more impact our business.
One last question for you. In the wake of the latest mass shootings, the conversation is being had once again about the role of corporations in gun control. You had CEO Tim Cook, of Apple, speak out against it. Has your stance as CEO of a payment processor for many gun purchases, has that changed at all over the last year?
So it really hasn't. To be clear, this is horrific, and it's terrible. Nobody should have to be in fear of going to a bar or going to shop at any kind of store or going to school. You have young children. I was talking about my daughter. It is incredible to imagine that something could happen. That said, we are guided by the federal laws in a country, and our job is to create and facilitate fair and secure commerce. And the reality is that legislators need to do their job. We will follow the laws of the land, and legislators need to do their job to deal with this horrific issue in the United States.
As you see some of the other payment processes in your space make that decision, your stance hasn't changed at all?
Make what decision?
To not to control their policies as it relates to gun control, like Square and PayPal.
Well, the reality is it's very hard for us to do it, number one. But I believe that there are some very common sense things that legislators need to do. And if we start to get in the mode of being legislators, Deirdre, it's a very slippery slope. We shouldn't be determining what's right or wrong in terms of people's purchases. We shouldn't tell people that they can't purchase a 32-ounce soda. We shouldn't tell people they can't buy reproductive drugs. The reality is that we are in the business of facilitating commerce. Legislators are in the business of deciding what the laws of the land are, and they ought to get busy on some common sense changes to deal with the horrific problems that we've seen in the United States, not just this weekend, but for years and years. And it's time to start looking at mental health, the size of these magazines, the type of weapons. They've got to do something.